We'll be picking up this episode in May of 1788 as France's old regime spirals towards anarchy. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Last time on Everything History, a lot happened. We covered the year 1787 and the beginning of 1788. During that time, King Louis XVI and his ministers attempted to stabilize the kingdom. However, they met with much resistance. Far more resistance than they expected, that was for sure. You see, the king wanted to reform several parts of his crumbling kingdom, primarily the tax code, but tradition dictated that in order to quote-unquote pass these laws, they needed to be approved by the Parliament of Paris. Parliament in this case spelled P-A-R-L-E-M-E-N-T. And while this was supposed to be just a political tradition, no more than a formality, it proved fatal to any hope of restoration the king had hoped for. The clergy and the nobles representing the parliament refused to cooperate, and much of the 1787 year turned into a political tug-of-war battle between King Louis and the First and Second Estates. By May of 1788, very little had gotten done, and the common people and peasants of the Third Estate were absolutely fed up with how their government was being managed. So, we re-enter the fray several months deep into 1788, with tensions high across the board. As April dwindled into May, many papers and pamphlets were publishing works scathing the government of King Louis XVI. The reason I bring up these anti-government works is because they had a very strong and very wrong influence on the populace of France. The influence was wrong because the information was false. It was honestly no more than gossip. But the more controversial and wild the publication, the more it sold. The king tried to use his various resources to stop such lies from being read, but it was impossible. They were flying throughout the country as if being conjured out of thin air. It is suspected by many historians that many of the anti-government writings were financed and backed by nobles and clergy members intent on resisting King Louis at every stage. An example of what I mean came in April that announced in a massive pamphlet campaign that several of the king's ministers were doing the work of the devil, and assured their readers that if they succeeded in any of their actions, they would squeeze every ounce of liberty and life out of France. The effect of this campaign was a resounding negative success, meaning that the Third Estate and common people were absolutely convinced that the king and his ministers were trying to accomplish vile, evil deeds. Yet this deception was actually not the truth, but as King Louis was realizing, the truth mattered very little in a time like this. And every step the monarchy took to stifle such horrible journalism in the country was seen as an act of literary suppression. Thus, King Louis XVI was in a very precarious position. The predicament he was in was so bad that it seemed like no matter what he did, it was destined to fail. Let's step out of the historical bubble here. I feel that it's very important to truly put ourselves in the shoes of historical characters. Such a method is often helpful in understanding the decision-making of certain people, and at the very least, it makes history more interesting. In this case, let's take a step into the mind of King Louis XVI in early May 1788. I'd love to share with you exactly what the king was thinking, but sadly not many of his writings have survived. If he wrote any at all, that is. That's okay though, because we know what he was thinking, right? And that's what matters most. King Louis was dealing with the Parliament of Paris, and the smaller local parliaments, none of which had any intention of cooperating. And such adamant, foolhardy resistance tied Louis's hands behind his back. He was also dealing with his massive populace of 27 million people of the Third Estate, who greatly despised any actions he did. Such animosity from them bound his feet as well. Not only that, King Louis was attempting to prevent France from collapsing into bankruptcy. This was like having a massive financial gorilla on his back. So, metaphorically, King Louis XVI had a gorilla on his back with both his arms and legs bound together. That is the scenario he was in, and as you hopefully now understand, that is a whole lot of pressure to be under. And with Louis already being a notoriously weak man, such pressure has even more impact. So I ask, what would you do in King Louis' stead? I don't know about you, but I probably would have strongly considered bailing, just giving up on the whole situation. And I very much believe Louis had those very thoughts. But did he take the back door out? No. He talked to his advisors, his people, and came up with yet another game plan. This plan was another series of reforms, but this time it was different. These reforms weren't based on taxation or the trenches of finances, but actually intent on France's judicial system. So what are the plans, Thomas? I'll get to the heart of the matter now. The king, his comptroller, and his justice minister wanted to rapidly reshape the cumbersome bureaucracy of the nation. Specifically, they wanted to strip the parliaments over their influence over affairs. These reforms were really the last-ditch effort by the French monarchy to maintain supremacy in France. William Doyle speaks on this saying, quote, "They sought to destroy permanently the ability of the parliaments to obstruct policy. The parliaments were to be reduced to simple appeal courts." End quote. So the monarchy was attempting to say once and for all that they had the true power in France. To demonstrate their royal preeminence, they were trying to diminish the authority of the parliaments and other such assemblies of court. This begs several questions here that require some sort of answer, or explanation. Number one, how did the monarchy suppose to go about getting such a sweeping reform to work? And also, question number two, what would be the reaction of the parliaments and their members to such reforms? So, question number one, what was the plan to have such a reform go in effect? And how did the sovereign and his ministers intend to get all of France to accept such a measure? The answer to that is a two-parter. Firstly, they hoped to gain the popular opinion, and they intended to gain public support through a publication campaign. A week or so before their proposals were to be announced, they released widespread statements and pamphlets detailing the success their financial reforms were finding, and they also noted that their new reforms would tackle abuses in the criminal justice system. This had a relatively positive effect throughout much of Paris and gave some hope to King Louis. Secondly, the other part of the answer to how the administration planned to implement these plans is by force. Not militant, but political force. The royal ministers stressed to King Louis that he needed to remain strong and not waver. They believed that a strong nerve would allow the reforms to pass. That brings us to the next question I've introduced. Question number two, how would the parliaments and the members therein react to these reforms? Not well, I would say, because as you might imagine, people rarely agree to be stripped of power, and people rarely let themselves be embarrassed politically. To fully answer this question, though, we need to delve back into the story. On or around May 8th, the edicts came down from King Louis XVI. They declared that all parliaments were to be put in immediate recess. They called this a quote-unquote vacation. The sovereign administration knew it wouldn't be easy, so military force was dispersed throughout Paris in order to maintain order and make sure that the parliaments properly disbanded. For some hours, everything appeared to be going to plan. Paris seemed to be functioning in a sort of stunned silence. However, this was simply the calm before the storm because riots erupted throughout the country. The assemblies refused to disband in both Paris and the countryside, and public support radically moved again against the king, his ministers, and his reforms. Simon Schama described the situation by noting, quote, "Neither the official publicity nor the military planning could allay the immense outpouring of public wrath." End quote. The public protests took France by storm. They were not yet violent, but throughout May, France continued to be rocked by societal fracturing. Most people had little clue what was actually going on, but one thing they knew for sure is that their country was in danger in every possible way. Protesters began to ignite fires in the streets, launch makeshift fireworks, so much so that Paris was said to glow all the way into June. As the protests inspired unrest in the other provinces of France, the monarchy was faced with another problem. They didn't have enough troops to prevent riots in the more remote provinces. Fears of mass violence began to plague King Louis, and even his ministers were worried about the scale of the resistance. The tension between the resisting protesters and the government continued until protests ignited in many cities throughout France. The cities of Pau, Rennes, Bascon, Metz, Dijon, Toulouse, Rouen, Bordeaux, Gis, and Douai all suffered from public unrest. Clearly, France was falling fast into either civil war, anarchy, or chaos, and no one really knew which. And finally, violence erupted between the two sides. This violence was to be the very first of the still developing French Revolution. And it occurred on June 7, 1788, in the city of Grenoble, which lies in southeast France near the French Alps. The day of June 7th has now come to be known as the Day of Tiles. The day began with a small military presence entering Grenoble sent by the provincial governor to assure that the local parliament would peacefully disband. And the historian Schama adds, quote, "And they might well have done so had it not been for the decisive intervention of the crowd. At around 10 in the morning the stalls and shops all shut, and the workers walked out of their workshops and poured into the center of town. Their aim was to prevent the departure of the magistrates. A group shut the city gates to prevent reinforcements, and another began to besiege the governor's own house." End quote. Those are rapid and dangerous developments indeed for a civilian population to take, but note what the author told us. He said, quote, "Their aim was to prevent the escape of the magistrates." So the driving force of the riot was fueled by the desire to besiege the local judges, leaders, and the governor himself, who they referred to as magistrates. They weren't actually there to go after the soldiers, but they weren't going to let the troops prevent them from extorting the magistrates. And there lies the cause of the Grenoble insurrection on the 7th of June. Because the royal soldiers weren't going to simply let anarchy win the day, they were required to keep the peace. And in the military's efforts to be peacekeepers, things got out of hand and fast. The soldiers were ordered not to fire on any civilians, but the rowdy crowds had no such reservations. Scores of rioters climbed atop the roofs of Grenoble and began pelting roof tiles down at the soldiers. Such violence was actually quite lethal. Several platoons reported dozens of injuries from the debris, and in the chaos of the moment, several soldiers began firing into the frenzied crowd. And by the day's end, 4 people were killed with another 40 wounded, and the soldiers had to evacuate the city. But as the regiments left, the chaos intensified. The people proceeded to demolish dozens of street shops and set fire to emblems of the crown, even going so far as to pillage and ravage the governor's own house. And that day is now known as the Day of Tiles. That's all very interesting, especially since blood was now spilt in France, but how does the Day of Tiles size up in the development of our story? It's obviously an important event due to the sheer violence and news that it created, but it had a more meaningful impact than even that. The Day of Tiles rallied the resistance, and other such riots bloomed across the provinces in prominent urban cities such as Pau and Rennes. And by July, the situation was completely out of hand. Neither the king nor the parliaments could control or prevent the far-reaching anarchy that was seizing their nation. This was a sign to all the leaders of Europe that France was truly buckling, and no one really knew what was to come next. Truly, by the time July began, the leaders of France were terrified about what was happening, and even more appalled by the fact that the protest kept going. What this means to us is that the king's final hope of avoiding the Estates General and putting France on the path to recovery had failed miserably. The nobles and clergy had refused to yield, and the people had erupted in a furious anger. Consequently, the markets only worsened, and the monarchy was forced in early summer to accept even more loans at even higher interest rates. As a result of this, the king was forced to give up on yet another series of reforms, and in July his ministers announced to the public that they would begin planning the calling of the Estates General. This announcement greatly pleased many people, and, very slowly, the protests began to subside in the summer months, but the king was devastated. This defeat truly disturbed King Louis. It had been his last valiant effort, and its failure now severely changed his mental state thereafter. Before this failure, the king had been moderately tentative, but now Louis was absolutely indecisive on everything. Most likely, King Louis was going through so much stress that he was actually suffering from crippling anxiety and psychological disorders. And this is what began to affect him thenceforth. His sister Elizabeth noted with pity and sympathy that, quote, "The king is forever backing off. He is always afraid of making a mistake, and he is tormented by the fear of having done an injustice." She feared for the state of her brother, but the king was not allowed to rest because France was on the precipice. France was only weeks, perhaps even days, from falling into bankruptcy. And when I say bankruptcy, I refer to more than just finances. What I mean is that France's society as a whole was approaching the brink of bankruptcy. Their politics were beyond broken, their financial situation was horrifying, and their culture had no idea what to do with itself. William Doyle adds that France had, quote, "collapsed in every sense, leaving an enormous vacuum of power." And on August 8th, the King's Comptroller declared that the king would convene the Estates General. The date for the meeting was set to May 1st, 1789. The Comptroller General, fully aware of how hated he was and how irreparable the state was, resigned shortly after. I would like to interrupt here because most historians do not assert that the French Revolution had truly began at this time, but I propose a different view. I believe a strong argument can be made that at this time, August of 1788, France's Ancien Régime had already collapsed. There was no recovery for the Kingdom of France after this time, and the French Revolution would be born in the ashes of the fallen old regime. So I believe the French Revolution truly took hold in August of 88, but no one quite knew it yet. Don't get me wrong though, things could and would get far worse in France, but I'm just saying that there was no longer any real hope that the Kingdom of France could survive. Indeed, France was to see an ocean of blood before their country stepped out of societal pandemonium. That's all a long ways off though, and we have a lot of story left before the Estates General was to begin in May of 89. After the resignation of another one of his financial ministers, Louis was induced to replace him with a popular financier named Jacques Necker. Jacques Necker is someone who I've mentioned offhand several times before in episodes past. He had actually been King Louis's financial minister once before, but had been fired because he had lied about the state of the French economy. In other words, Necker had previously committed national fraud. But not many people knew this had ever happened. In fact, most people that heard the accusations refused to believe them. Thus, through an odd turn of events, Necker had actually somehow remained popular among nobles and peasants alike in the tumultuous 1780s. And this truly was the entire reason King Louis had Necker serve again. The monarch hoped that the financial wizard, as he was colloquially known, could somehow give hope to France. However, moneylenders and interested national bystanders, including those in London, Amsterdam, Geneva, and even Washington, were not so confident. They now believed that a new France would be able to honor its financial obligations more habitually than its old regime. And the events of 1788 only served to cement their views. Speaking of struggling, France was struck by yet another blow as the summer of 1788 ended. I feel like we're beating a dead horse at this point, and it makes you wonder if all this was inevitably going to end in a bloody conclusion. Nevertheless, it is true, another problem assailed France. Because France was struck by an extremely abnormal hailstorm during the summer that plunged all France into a bizarre cold spell. This dramatically impacted the upcoming harvest in a very bad way and proved to be yet another sign that the future was bleak. This caused a disastrously poor harvest in 1788, and the price of bread spiked as September began. In fact, grain prices would continue to rise until the summer of 1789. This triggered another spell of protest, and as France descended towards a harsh winter, the country grew extremely hungry, and it is no wonder that the great mass of people wanted a governmental overhaul because every facet of the current system had utterly failed them. At the moment, the hope of the public resided in the upcoming Estates General. They desperately hoped the assembly would mean the end of their societal tragedy. This brings us to the question of who were to be the representatives at the Estates General. You see, this assembly was far different than any other in France because the assembly was actually the meeting of all three estates of France. That meant the clergymen, the nobles, and the commoners alike would all be meeting together with the king and his staff. The thing was, though, there were a limited number of seats. The last time the estates met in 1614, each estate had an equal number of seats. The third estate was not going to let that fly in 1789, though. The people of the third demanded at least double the representation of the other two estates. They demanded this on the grounds that they represented 97% and therefore deserved a far greater representation. This was a good argument, but not many nobles or clergymen liked this idea. And the anger of the third estate immediately shifted to the nobles and the clergy. This was really the first time that the hatred of the masses had been focused in on the first and second estates, but it would not be the last. Jacques Necker, now acting as a sort of prime minister, announced that the matter would be settled by a convocation of the Assembly of Notables in November. He also gave the publishing houses free rein to publish essentially whatever they wanted. This created a sort of build-up of suspense as November grew closer. However, on September 25th, the Parliament of Paris made a fatal blunder as they came back into session. The Parliament announced that they recommended the Estates General be convened as it was in 1614. This incensed the commoners, and all respect granted to them previously went out the window. And now that censorship had been removed, the literary media of Paris tore into the aristocracy. At a rate of approximately 10 pamphlets a day being published by several hundred printers, political literature slamming the aristocracy began to flood the streets of Paris and the surrounding area. The privileged classes were under attack, and this frightened many of the elite of France. However, not all of the aristocracy were opposed to the notions put forth by the Third Estate. Some members of the Paris Parliament even proposed radical changes of their own. Men such as Adrien Duport, Sémonville, and Torguet insisted that the votes of the Estates General be compiled on a person-to-person basis. This was out of the norm, actually, because usually during any assembly of the estates, each estate would vote as one unit. So, for example, if the first estate had 100 representatives and the majority voted yes, then all 100 would be counted as saying yes, despite the possibility that only 51 had actually approved. The idea that each person could vote separately was a rather new idea and was being referred to as popular citizenship and was gaining resounding support amongst the masses. Indeed, men such as Lafayette, Duc Liancourt, Duc Lyons, and Duc Letrin were adamantly promoting such democratic ideals despite their personal wealth. A one Philip Maizat even joked that if one was to go to Marquis de Lafayette's home, you should, quote, make your prayers in the name of liberty, equality, and reason. Such Enlightenment ideals were picking up steam throughout France, but as the Assembly of Notables convened in November, most of the aristocracy was still opposed to the idea of giving the Third Estate more authority. So France was split again, this time between a people that wanted one thing and an aristocracy that wanted another. Let me give you a taste of how serious the Third Estate and the people were, too. By the way, listen for the Enlightenment buzzwords in some of these sections I'm going to read. The buzzwords include things like rights, natural, essential, eternal, the people, and things like that. The exact same language, by the way, that was placed throughout the American Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. In the journal entitled The Sentinel of the People, it was written, quote, "What does it matter to us what our fathers have done or how they have done it? The essential rights of man, his natural relations to his fellows in society, these are the eternal basis of every form of government." And in a publication entitled Patriotic Reflections, the author declared, quote, "There are but no innovations. People of Brittany, you are badly off and nobility is well off. But no innovations." The paper also dismissed the relic traditions of 1614 by saying, "Would the garment of 1614 fit us any better than the garment of a child fits a man in the prime of his life?" A nobleman, the Count d'Entragues, actually a friend of the late Jean-Jacques Rousseau, made a radical assertion on behalf of the Third Estate. The Count said, quote, "The Third Estate is the people, and the people are the foundation of the state. The other orders are merely political categories, while by the immutable laws of nature the people are everything. Its safety should be the first law of the state, and it is in the people that all national power resides, and it is for the people that all states exist." End quote. That is but a taste of the language and conversation and debate throughout France in late 1788. I'm afraid, though, I must end the episode here, right before November 6, 1788, when the Assembly of Notables begin their proceedings. Make sure to join Everything History again as the story continues to quicken its pace. Next time, the notables will have to answer the questions and demands of the people, and the elections for the Estates General will begin soon after. Will the Third Estate, or rather, will the people get what they want? Come back next time to find out.
Thank you, and good night.